never did I ever refuse to wrestle anybody. There were some people that there were some people, honestly, and I probably shouldn't say this, but there were some people that I just really didn't want to wrestle.
He's the worst. That is exactly the line fans expect the moment they click on a video that promises Jerry Lawler naming 10 wrestlers who were fraud. The title alone pulls you in straight away. Jerry Lawler reveals 10 wrestlers who were fraud. It sounds simple. It sounds like Lawler sat down one day and gave one clean list of names, and that list settled the argument forever. But the real story is bigger than that, and it goes much deeper than a normal wrestling countdown. Wrestling fans love shoot videos because they promise the truth behind the curtain, the kind of truth that never made it onto a poster or a television commercial. They promise the real story behind the smiles, the handshakes, and the scripted feuds that filled up decades of television, night after night, city after city. And when the name attached to that story is Jerry Lawler, the story carries real weight. Lawler was never just a wrestler. He was a star in the ring for over 40 years. He was a booker behind the scenes, deciding who won and who lost on any given night, across an entire territory. He was a promoter who ran his own territory with his own money on the line, year after year, through good times and bad. He was the loudest and proudest voice to ever come out of Memphis wrestling, a voice that carried across decades, and that gives everything he says extra power. And if stories like this make you love the old fight game even more, use the hype feature and give this video some hype, because this one goes deeper than a normal wrestling list. But here is the truth. The word fraud does not mean just one thing in wrestling. A fraud can be a wrestler with a great look but poor skill in the ring, someone who never learned the craft underneath the muscles. A fraud can be someone who refuses to work safely with others, putting real bodies at real risk. A fraud can be a copycat gimmick, wearing another man's identity, borrowing fame that was never earned. A fraud can be a star who only draws money in one small town, propped up by a national spotlight he cannot really carry. And sometimes, a fraud is something far more serious. Sometimes a fraud is a business deal built on lies, the kind that can send real money into the wrong hands and destroy a company forever. This list goes through all of it. Some names will surprise you. Some names will make sense the second you hear them. And one name at the very end will show you that the word fraud in wrestling can mean something far more real than anyone expects. Something that ended up in front of judges and juries instead of just wrestling fans. These stories span decades, from small Southern television studios in the 1970s all the way to a federal courtroom in the 1990s, and they involve a wide range of people, from wrestlers with household names to a businessman most fans have never even heard of before today. Every single one of them touches Jerry Lawler's career in some way, and every single one shows a different side of what the word fraud really means once you step behind the curtain and look past the poster, the theme music, and the announcer's introduction. So let's count them all the way down, starting right now at number 10. Number 10, The Ultimate Warrior. Before he was the Ultimate Warrior, he was Jim Hellwig, a young man with a huge frame and very little polish in the ring. He came into Memphis wrestling in November 1985, working under the name Jim Justice Hellwig for Jerry Jarrett's Continental Wrestling Association. He teamed up with a young Steve Burton, the man the world would later know as Sting. Together they were called the Freedom Fighters, and they worked under the guidance of manager Dutch Mantell, learning the ropes in one of the toughest territories in the country. Memphis fans in that era expected a certain kind of wrestling. They wanted psychology. They wanted a story told with every single move, every reaction, every facial expression. Hellwig struggled badly to connect with that style. He simply had not learned it yet, and it showed every time he stepped through the ropes. His time in Memphis did not last long, and he moved on to Bill Watts's territory, where he became part of a duo called the Blade Runners. Wherever he went, the pattern stayed the same. His body did the talking. His skill in the ring stayed far behind, and veterans around him noticed. Promoters kept giving him chances because the look was simply too good to ignore, a walking billboard for the wrestling business. But looks alone have never been enough to earn lasting respect inside a locker room built on decades of tradition and unwritten rules about how a match is supposed to be worked. Years later, in 1996, Hellwig returned to the WWF as the Ultimate Warrior, and he was placed in a feud with none other than Jerry Lawler. On a live edition of Monday Night Raw, Lawler tried to hand Warrior a framed portrait as part of the storyline, a simple prop moment meant to build heat for their upcoming match. But Warrior feared the glass in that frame would break over his head for real, so he wore a baseball cap during the segment to protect himself from any accident. Lawler later said that single baseball cap gave the whole angle away. A face-painted warrior character, larger than life and covered in wild colors, suddenly wearing a plain baseball cap on live television, told sharp fans exactly what was coming next. It broke the illusion before the moment even happened, and it told Lawler something important about the man he was about to work with. The real damage came at King of the Ring in 1996. During their match, Warrior refused to sell Lawler's piledriver, one of the most respected and protected moves in Southern wrestling, a move that veterans treated as sacred. Instead of showing any effect from the move, Warrior popped straight back up almost instantly, built a quick comeback, and beat Lawler in under 4 minutes. For old-school veterans watching, that was the moment the mask came off completely. Warrior was not respecting the business. He was not respecting the code that generations of wrestlers had built and protected. He looked like a star, with the body and the paint and the entrance music. But the trust required to be a true professional simply was not there underneath it all, a gap that no amount of face paint or bodybuilding could ever fully hide from the men working closest to him. Fans watching at home saw a decisive win for a returning legend. Veterans backstage saw something else entirely, a young star refusing to give an older performer the respect that decades in the business are supposed to earn. That single match, more than any promo or interview, is the reason veterans still bring up Warrior's name whenever the subject of manufactured stars comes up. The body was real, the presentation was real, but the willingness to protect a fellow performer, the very thing the whole business depends on, was missing when it mattered most. Number 9. Sid Vicious, also known as Psycho Sid. Sid Udy had one of the most incredible looks the wrestling business has ever produced. He was massive, intense, and instantly believable as a threat the moment he walked through the curtain. His early days saw him working as Lord Humongous under Lawler and the Memphis booking team, learning the business from one of its sharpest minds. He had all the tools to become a huge draw, and in many ways, over the years that followed, he did become exactly that, headlining major shows across multiple promotions throughout his career. Fans genuinely believed in him as a threat, and that kind of natural credibility is something very few performers ever manage to achieve, no matter how hard they train or how many years they spend in the ring. But for years, Sid was followed by one persistent rumor that never seemed to go away. People in the business said he would skip wrestling dates to go and play softball instead, treating a hobby as more important than his professional commitments. It became a running story, one that damaged his reputation as a reliable professional in an industry where reliability meant everything. Sid always denied the simple version of that story. He said the truth was more complicated and tied heavily to politics inside the locker room. According to Sid, he only played competitive softball during 2 specific stretches, when he could not wrestle anyway, not as a replacement for wrestling duties. The first came after major lung surgery while he was working for WCW, a serious medical procedure that kept him out of action for a real recovery period. He was sent home to heal and rebuild his size before returning to television. During that time, he played local softball in Memphis to stay active. Lawler, an avid softball player himself, and a man who kept a close eye on the business around him, reportedly spotted Sid on the field and reported it straight to WCW management. As punishment, Booker Ole Anderson ordered Sid to lose a televised match to Lex Luger in just 5 seconds, a humiliating result for a man of his size and standing. It was a public message sent to the whole locker room about what happens when trust breaks down, delivered in the most visible way possible. The second softball period came later, during a contract gap between WWE and WCW, when Sid genuinely had no wrestling commitments at all. Sid said he only played as a designated hitter during that time, avoiding any real physical risk to his legs before returning to full-time competition. Whether every detail of the story was fair or not, the lesson stuck inside the business for years. In the old-school wrestling world, reliability was tested constantly, and Sid's aura took a hit because of it, no matter how many times he tried to explain his side. He had the look of a superstar, the kind of presence that could headline any arena in the country, but for a long stretch of his career, the trust around him was never quite complete. He carried championships in multiple major promotions over the years, proving the doubts about his drawing power were never really the issue. The issue was always whether the men calling the shots believed he would show up when the business needed him most. Booking offices around the country kept the softball story alive for years, using it as a quiet way to justify decisions about pushes and paydays. It followed him from territory to territory, long after the truth of any single incident had been forgotten. In a business built entirely on trust between performers who put their bodies on the line for one another, even a rumor like that could shape a career for good. Number 8. Ghetto Blaster and the Soul Train. Not every fraud in wrestling history was a major star with a national push behind him. Some were cheap, disposable characters created purely to fill out a card and borrow heat from bigger acts already established on television. In 1994, the USWA introduced a tag team called Soul Train. It featured a wrestler billed as Lucifer, played by Steve Collins, alongside a partner known as Ghetto Blaster, a name built entirely for shock value rather than originality. Memphis wrestling often leaned on masked or generic gimmicks to fill out cards without spending real money on established national talent, and Ghetto Blaster was a clear example of that approach in action. The name itself borrowed from popular culture of the era, and it also echoed the finishing move used by WWF star Bad News Brown, a detail that made the borrowing even more obvious to sharp fans. There was nothing original about it, and nobody involved was really pretending otherwise behind the scenes. In the ring, Ghetto Blaster and his partner worked as simple mid-card heels, doing a job rather than building a legacy. They stirred up cheap heat through loud promos and rough brawling, the kind of easy reaction that did not require much creativity. For a booking team like Lawler's, characters like this were useful in a very specific and limited way. They existed to lose to bigger babyfaces on the card, protecting the standing of the promotion's real stars, while filling out the middle section of a busy television taping. This is the small-time version of fraud in wrestling, far removed from courtrooms or lawsuits. It was not a major scandal, and nobody lost real money because of it. Number 7. Ahmed Johnson. Tony Norris became Ahmed Johnson in the mid-1990s, and from the moment he stepped onto WWF television, it was clear the company saw something special in him. He had a huge, powerfully built frame, and an intense presence that jumped off the screen, the kind of physical package that television producers had been searching for throughout the decade. The push came fast and hard, faster than almost any other performer of that era. In 1996, he won the Intercontinental Championship at King of the Ring, cementing his spot as one of the promotion's fastest rising stars in front of a national audience. For a company always looking for the next larger-than-life character to build television around, Ahmed seemed like the perfect answer, a genuine athlete with a background that set him apart from most of the roster. But behind the scenes, a very different story was unfolding away from the cameras. Veterans in the locker room began to see Ahmed as genuinely dangerous to work with, not just difficult. Wrestlers like Val Venis later described him as stiff in the ring, meaning he hit far harder than necessary and failed to protect the people he was working with during matches. He lacked the basic mechanics that keep two performers safe during a physical, high-impact match, mechanics that most wrestlers spend years learning before reaching that level of television exposure. This was not a small issue that could be brushed aside. Real injuries started happening around him, and word traveled quickly through a tight-knit locker room. Trust began to break down, and fear started to replace the respect that a big push usually earns. As the pushback grew stronger from the very wrestlers being asked to work with him, WWF quietly stepped away from plans to elevate him even further into the main event picture, even though the physical tools were clearly there. Ahmed Johnson's case is one of the clearest examples of what fraud can mean inside a wrestling ring, separate from lawsuits or business deals entirely. Muscles and intensity can get a wrestler noticed by fans and by management alike. They cannot replace the basic skill of keeping another human being safe during a live, physical performance. When that skill is missing, the whole act becomes a risk that nobody in the locker room wants to take, no matter how impressive the body looks under the lights. Younger fans watching the highlight reels only ever see the finished product, the big spots, and the title win. They rarely see the quiet conversations backstage, the veterans warning each other before a match, or the growing hesitation from performers who once looked forward to working with him. That hidden side of the story is exactly why his name still comes up whenever old-school wrestlers talk about the difference between looking dangerous and actually being safe. Number 6. Dino Bravo. Adolfo Bresciano worked under the name Dino Bravo, and the WWF built his entire character around one bold, simple claim. He was billed as the strongest man in the world, a title designed to grab attention immediately. The company backed that title with public displays of strength on television, including a heavily promoted assisted bench press record attempt at the 1988 Royal Rumble, watched by a huge national audience tuning in for one of the biggest events of the year. To be fair, Bravo did have a real background in weightlifting long before he became a wrestling character. His strength was not invented from nothing, and he could genuinely lift serious weight. But veteran promoters and bookers still viewed his national presentation as inflated, well beyond what he could actually deliver at the box office in most cities. In Montreal, where his French-Canadian background gave him instant credibility and connection with local fans, Bravo was a genuine, reliable draw who could sell out arenas. Outside that specific regional bubble, though, his appeal dropped sharply and consistently. National bookers struggled to use him as a serious main event threat on a wider scale, because his drawing power simply did not travel well beyond his home region. The strongman gimmick worked brilliantly on a local stage where the crowd already loved him, but it could not carry the same weight nationwide against other top stars of the era. Bravo's later life ended in tragedy, with a gangland-style assassination in March 1993, a shocking and violent end. That ending should never be treated lightly or used for shock value in a story like this one. It simply stands as a harsh, real-world contrast to the larger-than-life character fans saw on their screens for years, a reminder that the man behind the gimmick was living a far more complicated life than television ever showed. Number 5. The Honky Tonk Man. This one is personal, deeply personal, because Roy Wayne Ferris is Jerry Lawler's real-life cousin, not just a rival on television. Their conflict did not start on national television in front of millions of viewers. It started deep inside the Tennessee Territory scene, long before either man became a household name across the country. In November 1978, Lawler cut a sharp, personal promo directly targeting Ferris on Memphis television. He mocked his cousin's bleached blonde look in front of the live studio audience. He said plainly that he had not helped Ferris build his career because Ferris needed to make it on his own, rather than lean on family connections and Lawler's own promotional standing. It was blunt, it was public, and it was clearly meant to sting on a personal level. Ferris eventually did make it, and he did it without Memphis or his cousin's help. He became the Honky Tonk Man in the WWF, and went on to hold a record-setting reign as Intercontinental Champion, one of the longest in the title's history. On paper, that success should have settled the family rivalry once and for all. Instead, it got worse over the years that followed, not better. Ferris used shoot interviews for years to attack Lawler's character and his version of what really happened between them. Lawler never softened his response. Not once, no matter how much time passed. He dismissed his cousin's entire outlook on the wrestling business as pure delusion, publicly and repeatedly. The bitterness followed both men for decades, well into their later careers, surviving retirements, television changes, and even the passing of other wrestlers who had once worked alongside them both in the same territory. During Lawler's 2011 feud with Michael Cole in WWE, there was talk behind the scenes of bringing Ferris in to align against him for extra heat. Lawler shut it down immediately. He refused to give his cousin access to a live, unscripted microphone, because after everything that had happened between them over the years, he simply did not trust him with it. This section is not about erasing Honky Tonk Man's success as a performer. He earned his spot in wrestling history through hard work and genuine talent. But through Lawler's eyes, his own cousin became someone unreliable, someone caught up in his own version of the truth, and someone who could never fully be trusted again, no matter how much time had passed between them. What makes this story sting more than most others on this list is exactly what made it so effective on television decades earlier. Family heat is real heat. Fans who never knew the two men were cousins simply saw two proud performers refusing to back down. Fans who did know the history understood there was something far more personal underneath every insult, something that never fully healed even after both men became legends of the business. Number 4. The Snowman. Eddie Crawford was trained by Jerry Lawler himself back in the early 1980s, learning the business directly from one of its sharpest minds. He wrestled under the name the Snowman, and by 1990, his story with the USWA turned into one of the strangest and most uncomfortable chapters in territory wrestling history. Crawford began giving real interviews on local R&B radio stations and in the Tri-State Defender, a respected African-American newspaper with real influence in the community. In those interviews, he accused the USWA, and Lawler by name, of racism and exclusionary booking practices. This was not a scripted storyline yet, not at that stage. It was real public criticism, aimed directly at a wrestling promotion and the men running it. Lawler and promoter Jerry Jarrett grew worried these accusations could cost them a huge part of their ticket-buying audience, a real and immediate business concern. Rather than deny or ignore the controversy completely, they made the decision to fold it directly into television programming. Crawford began crashing tapings alongside real civil rights activists, blurring the line between genuine protest and wrestling storyline. The matches themselves were worked in a wild, uncooperative shoot style, with both men throwing unpulled strikes designed to look completely real to the crowd watching at home and in the arena. Crawford eventually beat Lawler to win the USWA Unified World Heavyweight Championship, the top prize in the promotion. It should have been the high point of his entire career. Instead, even as champion, He found himself booked in mid-card matches, while Lawler kept headlining the biggest Monday night shows at the Mid-South Coliseum. The frustration built steadily, week after week, television taping after television taping, until a serious money dispute pushed Crawford to walk out of the promotion entirely in October 1990, taking the physical championship belt with him as he left. Number 3. Taz. Taz, whose real name is Peter Sinertia, was not a fraud because he lacked toughness in the ring. If anything, his entire story shows the opposite to be true. He represented a genuine threat to the old order of wrestling, and the old order pushed back hard against him because of it. When ECW talent began appearing in WWF programming in 1997, real tension followed almost immediately. Lawler had spent time on commentary mocking ECW as extremely crappy wrestling in front of a national audience. He questioned the size and legitimacy of its wrestlers on air, including Taz directly, dismissing years of hard work in a single sentence. That criticism was not taken lightly backstage, and it created lasting resentment. At the Manhattan Center, things nearly boiled over into a real physical confrontation. Taz wanted to confront Lawler in person after one broadcast, and the situation grew serious enough that Paul Heyman and Tommy Dreamer had to lock Taz inside a dressing room to keep the peace, with Dreamer physically holding the door shut against him. WWF had to arrange for Lawler to be quietly moved in and out of the building for his own personal safety, a clear sign of how real the hostility had become. The tension eventually spilled directly into the ring itself. At SummerSlam 2000, Taz completely no-sold Lawler's piledriver, refusing to show any effect from the move at all in front of a massive pay-per-view audience. Commentary tried to explain it away by saying Taz simply had no neck for the move to affect him properly. In reality, most people close to the situation saw it as exactly what it was underneath the excuse: a clear sign of backstage friction and a flat refusal to cooperate with the old guard of the business. Taz's story marks a real turning point in wrestling history, not just a personal grudge. The gentle, respectful Southern style that shaped Lawler's whole career was starting to give way to a rougher, more rebellious Attitude-Era attitude, and Taz stood right at the center of that shift, whether he intended to or not. Where Lawler's generation had built its reputation on protecting opponents and respecting a shared code, Taz and the wrestlers who came up alongside him in ECW built their reputation on looking as real and as dangerous as possible, even if that meant breaking a few of the old rules along the way. Neither approach was entirely right or entirely wrong. They were simply two different eras colliding in the same ring, and Lawler happened to be standing right in the middle of that collision, a veteran of Southern Territory wrestling suddenly sharing a locker room with performers who had built their entire careers on breaking exactly the kind of rules he had spent decades protecting. Number 2. Cheap imitation acts. Some frauds in wrestling were never real people at all in any meaningful sense. They were copies, built entirely to borrow someone else's identity for a quick profit at the box office. Regional promotions like Memphis and the USWA leaned on this tactic constantly, under Lawler and Jerry Jarrett's leadership over the years. One example was a character called Dirty Rhodes, a rough copy of the legendary Dusty Rhodes, billed to local audiences as Dusty's own cousin, in order to borrow instant credibility he had not earned himself through his own work. Another was Nightmare Freddy, a wrestler dressed almost exactly like the horror movie villain Freddy Krueger, cashing in directly on a huge pop culture trend rather than building any kind of original character from scratch. This was not just a habit limited to Southern territories either. WCW later introduced a character called the Renegade, clearly modeled on the look, energy, and entrance style of the Ultimate Warrior. The WWF did something very similar with a wrestler known as Gilbert, a direct parody built entirely on the massive popularity of Goldberg at the time. To longtime fans and industry purists watching closely, these acts were seen as some of the most obvious frauds of all, because they borrowed someone else's identity, instead of putting in the work to build their own from the ground up. These copycat gimmicks made quick, easy money in the short term for the promotions that used them, but they also revealed just how far promotions were willing to go to trick local fans into believing they were seeing something original and exciting, when really, they were just watching a cheaper version of someone else's hard work. National promotions were not innocent bystanders in this pattern either. Whenever a contract negotiation with an established star fell apart, a new company was often quick to roll out its own version of that same star under a slightly different name, betting that fans would still buy tickets for something that merely looked familiar. It was a shortcut, and like most shortcuts in wrestling, it worked just well enough to keep getting used, year after year, promotion after promotion, right up until fans grew sharp enough to spot the pattern for themselves and started calling it out for exactly what it was. And now, the final name on this list, the one true story that is not really about wrestling ability at all. Number 1. Larry Burton and the collapse of the USWA. Everything up to this point on this list has been about performance, safety, trust, or family conflict. This final story is different, and it is the one that truly earns the word fraud in its most literal sense. This is a story about real money, real courtrooms, and a real company that collapsed completely because of it. To understand how much was really at stake in 1996, you have to go back further, to how Lawler and Jarrett ended up owning the promotion in the first place. Years earlier, Lawler had held a version of a national title tied to the old AWA promotion, run by Vern Gagne. When Gagne's company failed to pay Lawler the money he was promised, largely because ticket sales for the AWA had fallen so low, Lawler responded by refusing to defend the title and holding on to the physical belt himself. Gagne eventually stripped him of it on television, a move that badly damaged the AWA's national credibility. Out of that dispute, Lawler and Jarrett leaned on their own championships to build the CWA, and later the USWA, into a self-sufficient regional promotion, one that no longer depended on a struggling national partner. That history matters, because it shows Lawler had already lived through one promotion collapsing around broken financial promises, long before Larry Burton ever entered the picture. For 20 years leading up to the autumn of 1996, Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler had co-owned the Memphis territory as equal partners, splitting the business exactly down the middle. By the mid-1990s, though, the business was losing money badly, year after year, as the wrestling landscape shifted around them. In the summer of 1996, Lawler offered to buy out Jarrett's half of the company entirely and take full control himself. Jarrett, worn down after decades in the business, agreed to sell his share for a large sum of money, and the deal was formally completed on November 15, 1996. At the very same time, in a move that would later raise serious questions, Lawler entered into an unusual employment contract with a man named Larry Burton, promising him a large sum of money paid out across 52 separate installments. While Lawler was still finalizing his purchase of Jarrett's share of the company, he was also quietly negotiating a second, separate deal to sell the entire USWA to Burton. In December 1996, Lawler paid Jarrett a portion of the agreed sale price and paid Burton a smaller amount on top of that, describing the payment to Burton as a finder's commission for helping arrange the next sale down the line. Burton then went looking for a buyer of his own, someone with real money and no background in the business. He found Mark Selker, a wealthy investor from Cleveland, Ohio, who had absolutely no experience or knowledge of the wrestling industry at all. Burton told Selker a story that was simply not true, and the gap between what he said and what had actually happened was enormous. He claimed he had personally bought the USWA from Lawler for a huge sum, far more than what had actually changed hands in the real transaction. He then offered Selker a 50% ownership stake in the company for a large investment payment. Selker, trusting the numbers he was given by a man he believed was a legitimate business partner, agreed to the deal and invested his money believing the USWA was a thriving, profitable enterprise on solid financial ground, the kind of investment that would pay him back many times over in the years ahead. It was not thriving at all, and the truth was very different from what Selker had been told. As the true financial state of the company slowly became clear to him, Selker realized he had been badly misled about nearly every part of the deal. In September 1997, he filed a lawsuit to try to recover what he had lost, hiring lawyers who began digging through the real financial history of a promotion he had believed was healthy. The legal fallout hit immediately and hard, and it moved faster than anyone in the promotion expected. A court order allowed the seizure of the USWA's video editing equipment, the very tools the company needed to produce its weekly television show and keep its broadcast deal alive. Without new episodes going out on air, the local television station threatened to end its broadcast agreement entirely, cutting the promotion off from its main source of exposure. Deprived of television, the USWA folded not long after, bringing an end to a territory that had survived for decades. So there they are, 10 very different kinds of fraud. Jerry Lawler stood at the center of almost every one of these stories, not because he personally caused all of it, but because his career stretched across so much of wrestling history that nearly every kind of deception in the business eventually crossed his path at some point, when you step back and look at all 10 names together. Old school wrestling made stars out of nothing. The frauds on this list were never all the same, and they should never be lumped together as if they were. Some were simply bad at their job despite a great look. Some were dangerous to work with, no matter how talented they seemed on television. Some borrowed an identity that was never truly theirs to begin with. Some let family bitterness poison everything around them for decades. And some crossed the line completely into real financial deception with real victims left behind. But together, all 10 of them tell you something important about the business Jerry Lawler spent his whole life inside, through good years and terrible ones alike. It was never just about who looked the strongest under the lights on a given night. It was always about who could survive the moment the curtain slipped, and the real story underneath got exposed for everyone to see. And Jerry Lawler, through every single one of these stories, proved again and again that he could. Whatever you think of him personally, whatever side of any of these arguments you land on, one thing is hard to deny. Few figures in wrestling history have stood so close to so many different kinds of fraud and still walked away with their name intact. From a baseball cap on live television to a federal courtroom in Tennessee, from a family feud that never fully healed to a copycat gimmick built to lose in 5 minutes, Lawler's career carried the full weight of what professional wrestling really was behind the curtain. It was never a clean, simple business. It was loud, messy, unfair, and sometimes genuinely dangerous. But it was also honest in its own strange way, because in the end, none of the frauds on this list ever managed to stay hidden forever. The truth always found its way out, one way or another, and Jerry Lawler was there to see almost all of it happen.